Our first story of the new year takes us to the Middle East. We're keeping a close eye on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad.
For several hours yesterday, that embassy was the scene of a violent protest. People stormed the perimeter, set some fires, and threw stones while chanting "Death to America." They were responding to U.S. airstrikes on militia targets. The protest later quieted, but supporters of that Iran-backed militia remain outside.
NPR's national security correspondent Greg Myrie is with us in the studio. Happy New Year, Greg.
Happy New Year, Noel.
A little while ago, I talked to Mustafa Salem. He's a Washington Post reporter in Baghdad. And I asked him, what does it look like outside the embassy? Here's what he said.
From last night, they have set up their tents and they spend the night. And this morning, also hundreds of people joined them from around Baghdad and outside of Baghdad. There were a few attempts also to burn more parts of the embassy, but they were stopped.
They set up tents. He said also they brought cooking supplies and food supplies. It sounds like these guys have plans to stay. What do we know about what's happening in Baghdad? What else?
Right. So in addition to this sort of less volatile version of a protest today compared to yesterday, about 100 Marines or so have been flown in to fortify the embassy. The Defense Department has announced 750 troops to the region. Kuwait seems a likely place where they're going to end up if needed. But if this goes on, I think there's really two stories to watch here. Now, one is this scene at the embassy and what it means for U.S. policy in Iraq, this very fraught effort to stabilize Iraq. But the second story is what this says about President Trump and his sort of maximum pressure campaign against Iran. We also need to keep an eye on that.
Okay, well, let me ask you about President Trump. He blamed Iran for the protests at the U.S. Embassy yesterday, even though, of course, they're happening in Iraq. He also tweeted to Iran yesterday, essentially, "I am not warning you, I am threatening you." That's not a direct quote, but that was the gist of his message. What does this mean for President Trump and Iran and how we move forward?
Right. So very unusual language to explicitly make this a threat. But it's important to remember President Trump has imposed these very tough sanctions on Iran. The U.S. is trying to cut off all of Iran's oil export, which is absolutely crucial to its economy. And this is squeezing Iran. Iran is looking for ways to hit back. And one is to call on these militias to go after U.S. forces. So this doesn't solve Iran's problems by any sense, but it shows that Iran is going to punch back against Trump's maximum pressure campaign.
And so in some ways here, Iraq is almost caught in the middle. The relationship between the United States and Iraq goes back, this type of relationship, to 1991. How in 2020 are we here?
Right. I mean, what we saw yesterday, the latest chapter in this long, painful history that just has never really gone as planned. So the U.S. forces drove the Iraqi troops out of Kuwait in 1991. This was the first time the U.S. had ever fought a war in the Middle East. But now we're looking at almost 30 years of nonstop involvement with evolving aims that have gone from containing Saddam Hussein, removing Saddam Hussein, defeating an insurgency, quashing ISIS. So here we are today, U.S. diplomats hunkered down in the embassy, unable to go out on the street.
And President Trump has always said, I don't want to be the guy that gets us more involved in the Middle East. I want us out. What options does he have at this moment?
He doesn't have good ones. There's 5,000 U.S. troops there. And given the circumstances, he can't really pull them out. So I think he is going to have to be, like it or not, committed to maintaining some similar course that he's on right now.
Okay, NPR national security correspondent Greg Myrie. Greg, thanks.
My pleasure.
All right, it looks as though North Korea is not ready to denuclearize.
Not at all. North Korea's Kim Jong-un delivered what an official had promised to be a Christmas present. In a speech to the ruling Workers' Party Central Committee, Kim announced a change in his approach to the United States. North Korea, he says, will no longer feel bound by a freeze on testing nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. Kim has been frustrated by a lack of progress in talks with the United States. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo responded on CBS News.
We hope that the North Koreans will reconsider, that they'll continue down that pathway. It's important. It's the right solution. We want peace, not confrontation.
So will there be confrontation?
NPR correspondent Anthony Kuhn is in Seoul. Hey, Anthony.
Hey, Noel.
So Kim was supposed to give this big New Year's speech that didn't end up happening. Why not?
Well, we expected it to go live on TV, but it didn't happen. He probably said all he was going to say to a plenum of the ruling Workers' Party, but we don't know exactly why they nixed it.
Okay, and so what did he say?
Well, he made a lot of very tough and dramatic remarks. He said the North would take shocking action. It would introduce a new strategic weapon, without saying what it was. And at the same time, he stopped short of saying that he was going to break off negotiations with the U.S., as Pyongyang has threatened to do. He said, look, North Korea imposed this moratorium of its own on testing for the past 2 years, but the U.S. has not responded positively, so they don't feel bound by it anymore. And he said many times that North Korea was going to conduct a frontal breakthrough, which he seemed to mean they were going to break free of U.S. attempts to isolate and sanction his country into submission. So clearly very hardline remarks, but not quite the total break from last year's policies that was widely expected.
Okay, and we heard Mike Pompeo in that tape just now say, we want peace. Has President Trump said anything yet?
Yeah, he says he believes Kim Jong-un is still a man of his word. He spoke to reporters outside his New Year's Eve party, and he said, look, Kim signed a document in Singapore at their summit in which he committed to denuclearization. But that document doesn't say what denuclearization means or how they're going to do it or when. Pyongyang insists that the ball is in Washington's court. And hence this threatening language about saying, you know, what you get for Christmas depends on your attitude. The U.S. insists that this is Pyongyang's choice to make. They've given the North creative proposals for moving things forward, but they haven't said what they are.
The United States still imposes sanctions on North Korea. As you mentioned, Kim says that he is going to try to get around them, defeat the blockade. By what means would he do that? Or was that just talk?
Well, his language was a bit different today. He said that North Koreans know how to overcome difficulties and tighten their belts. But he had said, you know, we've already got our nuclear deterrent, and now we're going to shift gears and focus on raising people's living standards. And that didn't happen. And there are clearly a lot of people who are going to be very unhappy about it. But in North Korea, there are not a lot of people who can publicize his shift of policy, much less hold Kim Jong-un to account for this.
NPR's Anthony Kuhn in Seoul. Anthony, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
All right, 2020 is likely to be a wild year in politics.
Yeah, I hate to make predictions, but that seems like a pretty safe one. The president's impeachment trial in the Senate could start soon. We don't know exactly when. And then you got your Democratic primary race with a lot of candidates still in the race. And that, of course, all leads up to the presidential election in November.
NPR national political correspondent Mara Liasson is with us to talk about some of what we can expect. Good morning and Happy New Year, Mara.
Happy New Year to you.
Okay, so one of the first things on the political calendar will be the impeachment trial. We've been waiting for some word on how this is going to work. Do we know anything new?
No, we don't. We're
Okay.
waiting for Congress to get back to Washington to find out when Speaker Nancy Pelosi will send the articles of impeachment over to the Senate and what kind of a trial the Senate is going to have. Democrats had been hoping that somehow a couple of Republicans would decide that they agreed with the Democrats and wanted witnesses at the Senate trial. That hasn't happened yet. President Trump initially said, or has been saying, that he wanted his own witnesses. He wants the whistleblower to testify. He wants the Bidens to testify. But he's also said that he would follow the lead of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who has said that witnesses were mutually assured destruction. McConnell wants a short trial, long enough to show the Senate's taking impeachment seriously, but not long enough to allow for new information to come out, because what we've learned is that new information will likely be bad for the president. We already saw a Freedom of Information Act suit result in some OMB documents being released that showed the extent to which White House officials not only held up the aid to Ukraine, but tried to keep that freeze secret from most everyone in the government.
Okay, so in the meantime, with all of these big questions still unanswered, we are 1 month away from the Iowa caucuses. What does it look like going in for Democrats?
Well, the race looks surprisingly similar to what it did 6 or 7 months ago. Joe Biden is still the front runner. He's still a vulnerable front runner. There has been some movement inside the top tier of candidates. Senator Elizabeth Warren rose, then fell in the polls. Senator Bernie Sanders has been remarkably resilient, considering he's the oldest candidate in the field and just had a heart attack, although there is a new poll that shows him slipping in both Iowa and New Hampshire. Mayor Pete Buttigieg has moved up. Senator Amy Klobuchar is trying to gain a foothold in Iowa. And the thing to watch for, I think, is who finishes in the top 3 in Iowa. Most Democrats say that Joe Biden can't afford to not just finish in the top third, but he has to be a very strong, very close to the top for him to maintain the momentum to go forward. Next big event for Democrats, 5 candidates have qualified for an Iowa debate on January 14th.
Just quickly, leaving impeachment aside for a second, how does President Trump look entering into this election year?
It's a very mixed bag. He's ending the year with some successes. He's going to sign a first part of a China deal. He'll probably get his new NAFTA agreement, USMCA, passed. The economy is strong. History tells us it's very hard to defeat an incumbent in a good economy. Of course, historical rules only work till they stop working. He has no external crises. Most of his crises are of his own making, except, as you heard, with Iraq and North Korea, those things can change. On the flip side, there has never been a more unpopular incumbent running for re-election.
NPR's Mara Elias. And Mara, thank you.
How much worse are Australia's bushfires than in the past, and what's that country want to do about it?
These are really important questions. 8 people have died in southeastern Australia since Monday. This is one of the worst fire seasons in the country's history. About 12 million acres have burned so far. A fire official in New South Wales named Shane Fitzsimmons talked to Australia's Channel 9. Here he is.
Unfortunately, the weather conditions, the weather forecast is shaping up for a worsening of the weather conditions than what we saw only 2 days ago.
Reporter Matthew Bungard of the Sydney Morning Herald has been covering all of this and joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
We've been looking at some of the images of Australia at npr.org, and it's astonishing. There's this photograph by Getty Images of 2 firefighters, and they're moving through a shower of flying embers blown by the wind. It looks like a rainstorm, except it's a little bit of burning material. What is it like in the areas that are being struck by fire?
Well, in a lot of places, it's really just nothing. Like, people have been going back to the towns that they, a day before had been, rich and vibrant and filled with things that they'd known their entire lives, and there's just nothing there. I mean, these fires, especially on the south coast in the last week, have ripped through entire towns and left them with nothing. I was speaking to someone yesterday who said that in some of these towns they've lost, 80% of the structures.
Well, that is useful to know because some of the other photographs that I was looking at npr.org are of what appear to be the remnants of towns, just melted metal, brick walls of otherwise blackened buildings. And that's not a distortion, you're telling me. If we went outside the frame, we'd see even more destruction.
Yeah, so this is the thing that perhaps when you're just seeing photos from the other side of the world, you might think that, you're getting the worst of it when you see like an image with a red sky or a dead animal or something like that. But that's really commonplace. I mean, there were towns that were pitch black at midday on the other day, because there was just so much smoke in the air that they couldn't see the sun. So, and there were other places where it was bright red, so because of the flames. So, a lot of people who have been around, the journalism game far longer than I have said that they've never seen anything like this in a previous bushfire season, and we've had some really bad bushfire seasons in the past.
And I feel obliged to mention that when you say statewide, that is the scale of a fairly large country because Australia is so large. We're talking about enormous areas that are affected here.
Yeah, to put that in perspective, you might have seen a couple of maps doing the rounds on Twitter in the last couple of days, but basically an area the size of some European countries is burning right now. I mean, I saw a couple of maps that was like half of the United Kingdom or the entirety of Belgium, or just to put in perspective for people who don't quite realize how big Australia is, just how much land is burning right now. I'm not sure what it is in acres, but it's well over 4 million hectares now. So, yeah, it is just such a massive area that is burning and continues to burn.
And what's it like as this fire season goes on and on and on? Does it feel different many weeks in than it might have felt a week in, for example?
Probably the most crazy thing about it is that you mentioned that the fire season goes on and on, but in most years when there are large bushfires, we wouldn't have even had the fire season start yet. So usually the worst of it happens towards the middle of January and into February. That's when we see the worst of it in most years. The fact that we had bushfires in early November in parts of the state is crazy, and the fact that they've mostly continued on through all of November and December is unbelievable. We're looking at potentially having a fire season of 4 to 5 months. That's nearly half a year of bushfire season, which is absurd.
And amid all of this, there was an editorial in your paper, the Sydney Morning Herald, and the headline was, "Bushfire Tragedy Shows Need for Climate Leadership." How much is the awareness of climate change part of the conversation that people are having in Australia right now?
It's been an issue that's been, in a lot of people's eyes, neglected for a very long time. Particularly, an image that keeps resurfacing lately is a photo from Parliament a couple of years ago when the current Prime Minister Scott Morrison brandished a lump of coal in Parliament, insisting that it wouldn't hurt anybody. And basically, in the last couple of weeks especially, these fires have prompted a lot of people that in the past have criticized climate change protests to actually admit that perhaps something is happening and that we need to act faster than what we're doing, and we need to admit that this is a real problem. So as there is a little bit of people starting to come around finally to the viewpoint that this is not normal. And if you speak to any firefighter or any person who's dealt with bushfire seasons in the past, they'll say this is not normal.
Matthew Bungard of the Sydney Morning Herald, thank you so much.
Thanks, Dave.
Israel's prime minister wants to stay in his country's government and out of its courts.
Right. Benjamin Netanyahu said this in a speech on TV. He's asking Israel's parliament, the Knesset, to grant him immunity from prosecution. He's been indicted on corruption charges, and he's getting ready for an election campaign that will be Israel's third in a year.
NPR's Daniel Estrin has been covering all of this and is on the line from Jerusalem. Daniel, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Can lawmakers really protect Netanyahu from a trial?
Well, they can. Netanyahu technically has a right to ask Parliament to grant him immunity from prosecution. Now, let's just remember, he's facing bribery charges, other corruption charges. He's accused of using the power of his office to help media executives get richer and in exchange getting expensive gifts and positive press. Netanyahu has long said that this indictment is a deep state plot to get him out of office. And so what he needs to do now is convince Parliament that the charges against him are politically motivated and that a trial would be against the public interest.
Now, I guess we should note that in the United States, there are some limits to the prosecution of public officials. You can't arrest a member of Congress while Congress is in session, for example, although you can put the person on trial. It's very hard to indict a sitting president because of some legal opinions that the Justice Department has had. So there are some limits, but is it customary, would it be normal and within the rules in Israel to say the prime minister can be immune from prosecution at all?
Yes, it is. I mean, technically, he doesn't need to resign if he faces indictment. He can continue to serve, and he has this right to ask Parliament to hold a vote and to grant him immunity if he can prove that the charges are politically motivated, and that's what he's trying to say. And he also has another ask to the Israeli public. Let's take a listen to what he said on TV. He says he wants to seek immunity because he wants to continue to lead Israel for many more years to achieve historic accomplishments. And one of those, he said, was to get a green light from the U.S. on a controversial move, which would be to annex lands in the occupied West Bank.
Okay, so he's saying, get this prosecution out of the way and I'm going to give you things that you really like. What are Israelis saying about this?
Israelis are divided on this, Steve. I mean, a recent poll suggested that about half of Israelis oppose Netanyahu getting immunity. And that poll also found that about a third of right-wing voters oppose it too. And they're usually Netanyahu's base. And even today, one columnist who has been sympathetic to Netanyahu had a column. He said Netanyahu's immunity request is kosher, but it stinks.
I appreciate the phrasing there. Daniel, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Sure, thanks, Steve.
NPR's Daniel Estrin reporting on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's request to Israel's Knesset for immunity from prosecution. All right, in this country, what might state legislatures accomplish in 2020?
Obviously, the atmosphere in Washington is deeply partisan, but on the state level, politics are sometimes different. In many states, one party has almost all the power, and that means they can get more done.
Reed Wilson follows this. He's a reporter for The Hill newspaper. He's in our studios. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming by. What's a state you would look at first?
Well, among the 50 equals, California tends to be king. And what has happened in recent years is that something will come out of California's state legislature in Sacramento, and then a number of other states across the country will duplicate that. What we're going to see this year is a move in a lot of states to allow NCAA athletes to be paid, for example, for the use of their likeness and image, something that passed in California last year and has already been introduced on a bipartisan basis in states like Minnesota and New York and Florida, and I expect there will be 20 more by the time everybody comes into session.
I guess we should note that California is one of those states where the governor and both houses of the legislature are all in the hands of one party, which means they can get done what they want to get done.
That's right. And across the country, 49 states are completely controlled at the legislative level by one party, which means that they can drive some form of agenda. And that's what we see a lot across the country is that these states are the experimental laboratories of democracy, as Louis Brandeis called them famously. And that means that the state level legislative accomplishments tend to drive what happens in Washington. You know, back in the 1990s, it was welfare reform that came out of the states and to the federal government. In the 2000s, it was healthcare reform that came from a state like Massachusetts and became the blueprint for the Affordable Care Act. And then most recently, even criminal justice reform started at the state level and was really the only thing that Congress got done on a bipartisan basis last year.
Well, Virginia just became one of those states where one party has all the power. Democrats have the legislature and the governor's chair. I was talking to voters the other day in Virginia, and there was a lot of discussion of gun control. What's going on there?
That was a key issue in the elections that in which voters handed control to Democrats for the first time in a generation. We're going to see a raft of gun control legislation coming out after this mass shooting that happened in Virginia Beach last year. Virginia is also going to try to do a lot of things that other Democratic states did in the past few years, updating voting reforms, updating things like they're going to try to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, which would make it the 38th state to do so. So Virginia, because of those elections in which Democrats took control, Virginia's going in a radically different direction this year.
Are there some red states where Republicans who have all the power have a big agenda?
What we're seeing in a lot of red states is a continuation of a push that's happened for a few years now to try to get abortion-related legislation into the courts. So a state like Georgia or Iowa or Alabama have passed in recent years measures to restrict the access to abortions, and their whole goal there is to get sued so that those laws will go to the courts and eventually work their way up to the Supreme Court, where the pro-life community believes they now have a 5-4 majority.
Now, there are some states where the governor is of one party, the legislature or part of the legislature is of the other party. Is there any place where the parties have that kind of divided government, but they just seem a little more pragmatic, a little more bipartisan than on the national level?
In a lot of states, the partisanship that exists in Washington, D.C. does not exist at the statewide level. And in talking to legislators over the last few years or last few months, they have talked about their efforts to really maintain that kind of order and decorum that doesn't exist here in Washington, D.C. They want to keep those lines of communication open. I was speaking to the Speaker of the Nevada Assembly a few years ago, and he told me that he'd actually bought an olive tree to put on his desk to convey to the Republicans who were in the minority that he was there to give an olive branch. Unfortunately, okay. and possibly as an appropriate capstone, the olive tree died.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, you keep cutting off the branches to give them away, and eventually the tree just can't take it anymore. Reed Wilson, thanks for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve.
He covers
Looking back on it now, we can see there was a warning of the airstrike that hit Baghdad overnight.
The U.S. Secretary of Defense delivered that warning yesterday. Mark Esper spoke to reporters about violent events in Iraq. Iraq is a battleground in the struggle for influence between the United States and Iran, and Esper said Iran was behind attacks on U.S. interests there.
There are some indications out there that they may be planning additional attacks. That's nothing new, right? We've seen this for 2-3 months now. So if that happens, then we will act. And by the way, if we get word of attacks or some type of indication, we will take preemptive action as well to protect American forces, to protect American lives.
You heard the phrase there, preemptive action, meaning the U.S. was willing to strike before Iran could carry off an attack. And that is how the U.S. Defense Department now describes what the U.S. did in Baghdad. Iranian General Qasem Soleimani arrived at the Baghdad airport. He'd been in Iraq many times before. He commanded Quds Force, which conducts operations outside Iran, including Iraq. But as he started into town this time, a U.S. drone was overhead.
What happened next? Many NPR reporters are covering this story. National security correspondent Greg Myrie is with us in the studio. International correspondent Deb Amos is in Beirut. And White House reporter Aisha Roscoe is on the line from D.C. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Greg Myrie, let's start with you. What did the U.S. drone do?
Right. So this is the early hours of Friday before dawn, and Soleimani apparently got in one of two cars, and the drone hit these cars, killing Soleimani and apparently a couple other people who were meeting him at the airport. It seems he was just departing from the airport. A major dramatic development, one of the most important figures in the Middle East.
Who was this man?
Qasem Soleimani was a military man his entire life. He was 62 years old, and he led the Quds Force. A rough analogy is sort of like the U.S. Special Forces. So he was the leader of Iranian forces that were operating throughout the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and for American purposes, his force, the Quds Force, was considered to have killed hundreds of Americans in Iraq over the past, 16 years or so that the U.S. has been fighting there.
Okay, so he was a critical figure. Iran this morning is promising retaliation. It's worth noting that several different voices at this point are speaking for Iran, from Iran. Who's saying what?
Right. So, we've got everybody from the supreme leader promising serious revenge, serious retaliation. We have the foreign minister calling this terrorism by the United States. So we're getting very strong reaction from Iran, and they have multiple ways they could strike back, from going after oil tankers in the Middle East to U.S. forces in Iraq and elsewhere.
Okay, and who else was killed in this strike?
Right. So one of the other figures that was killed is Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Now, he's an Iraqi, and he led these militia forces that were working with Iran. And it seems he had gone to the airport to meet Qasem Soleimani. And his group was involved in these rocket attacks that killed a U.S. contractor a week ago, and then were hit by U.S. airstrikes, and then have been protesting outside the U.S. embassy. So he's also a key figure and had been working very close with Qasem Soleimani.
Okay.
We hear something in Greg's statement there of Iran's rhetoric when they use the word terrorism. The U.S. uses the word terrorism about Iran. Iran is happy to turn that back and say, you say we're the terrorists, we say you're the terrorists. And here's a reality that the U.S. has to consider as it watches for possible Iranian retaliation. Iran has an archipelago of allies which stretch throughout Iran's region from Yemen in the east to Iraq in the middle and all the way over to Gaza and Lebanon, which border Israel. And NPR's Deborah Amos is in Beirut, Lebanon, watching all this. Hi there, Deborah.
Good morning.
What are Iranians saying, first of all?
Oh, it is remarkable as people are absorbing the loss. You know, some have called Soleimani Iran's indispensable man. He was a military man his whole life, a strategic thinker, and most recently he's been balancing military campaigns in Syria and Iraq. He was head of the Quds Force for decades, and that's a combination of the CIA and special forces. And his death has been a shock, as we hear from a political science professor, Hamid Mousavi. We reached him this morning at the University of Tehran. He said Iranians are used to the proxy war that's been going on between the U.S. and Iran for decades. But this escalation is new and it's unexpected.
I think many Iranians were surprised. Killing a top Iranian official and doing it so publicly, essentially assassinating him, is a very major escalation of hostilities. It would be akin to Iran assassinating the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Essentially, it's an active war.
Soleimani was a cult figure in Iran. He was one of the most popular figures in the country. And Mousavi, the political science professor, cited an American poll that shows that he had the highest approval rating of any public figure, much higher than even the Iranian president.
Okay, so let's talk about that archipelago of allies. What are some of Iran's friends, including major powers, saying and doing?
So the Russians condemned it as reckless, not a surprise. The Syrian reaction has been particularly harsh. Soleimani played a big role in the military operation that propped up Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. In Iraq, that's been where the reaction has been the most interesting. The official reaction has been measured. Essentially, it is a prey for the country because Iraq is a likely place where we could see escalation. This is a place where Iranian forces and U.S. forces have some proximity. There's also another interesting detail. There's been 3 months of street protests, and many of those Iraqi protesters have been against Soleimani and Iran, who they say has been backing this strategy to crush their movement. So you can see media in the Middle East have been playing clips of those protesters saying that they are glad that he's dead.
All right, I want to bring in NPR's Ayesha Roscoe. Ayesha, this, of course, happened overnight, so we essentially woke up to this news. President Trump, we know, ordered the strike. What have we heard from him and from inside of the White House?
So not much at this point. Really, the only official responses come from the Defense Department. But President Trump, he did tweet this picture of an American flag. And that's really the only reference that he has made. We think that he's making it to what happened with Soleimani. So far, nothing else on the Twitter feed, which is the way President Trump will normally respond to these things. But we'll have to see if they have more to say today.
A picture of the American flag and no words with it, which was really interesting. Although it's early, lawmakers in Congress, some of them anyhow, are responding. What are they saying?
Well, so like with so many instances these days, the reaction is really playing out along party lines. Republicans so far are mostly standing with the president and his decision. Senator Tom Cotton said that Soleimani got what he, quote, richly deserved and that America is safer now that he's gone. They're saying that this is a man that was a threat to the U.S. and that he was dangerous. And Democrats are not disagreeing with that idea, really, but they are also saying that this was a very serious action, and they're asking for an explanation about this decision. Senator Richard Blumenthal said that taking this step could bring on the most consequential military confrontation in decades. And what Democrats are saying is that this doesn't end here and that the U.S. needs to be prepared for retaliation from Iran and its proxies. There's also some legal questions. The House Foreign Affairs Chair, Eliot Engel, said this strike went forward with no notification or consultation with Congress, and that Congress has not authorized war with Iran. So there's real uncertainty about where the U.S. goes from here and what types of plans the Trump administration has in place to deal with the repercussions.
Okay, let's circle back to Greg Myrie here, because, Greg, we've heard the phrase that Qasem Soleimani, perhaps a new name to some Americans, but you said he was a cult figure inside Iran. Let's dwell on why he would be, because you've covered this region for many, many years, this period of history back to 1979 when Iran has been active throughout the Middle East. What was Soleimani? Was he the face of Iran's wider ambitions for the region and the world?
Yeah, I mean, you may have heard a lot about the sort of Shia crescent, Iran trying to expand its presence and influence across the region ever since the 79 revolution. And Soleimani really was not the architect, but also the operational leader. He was the guy who went to Iraq to deal with the militias there. He went to Syria to deal with Bashar Assad, the president. He worked with Hezbollah in Lebanon. So more than any other single figure, he was the face of this Iranian expansion throughout the region.
And so everything that made him a dark figure to the United States makes him a symbolically powerful figure for Iran.
That's right. He held this. He didn't often say a lot, but he just had this presence about him. He'd pop up on the battlefield. He would pop up in Moscow. He would pop up often in military fatigues, and you knew he was an important person doing serious business.
Now and again over the years, even working with the United States or alongside the United States.
That's also true.
Greg, thanks very much.
My pleasure.
That's NPR's Greg Myrie. We also heard from NPR's Aisha Roscoe and NPR's Deborah Amos on the death of Qasem Soleimani, killed in a U.S. drone strike at the Baghdad airport in Iraq overnight.
And we want to note that this is a developing story. If you want the latest news, you should tune into your NPR station or visit us.
In more than 40 years of confrontation between the United States and Iran, only a few moments have felt as perilous as this one.
Iran is vowing, quote, hard revenge after a U.S. strike killed an Iranian general. President Trump is vowing destruction inside Iran if its forces target any Americans. We are tracing the words and deeds of both sides this morning, and we begin on the streets of Tehran. Thousands of mourners followed a procession for the body of General Qasem Soleimani. The eulogists for the prominent general included Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Another, Mahmoud Karimi, spoke partly in English.
Hey, U.S., you started! We will end it!
You started it, we will end it. Our colleague Mary Louise Kelly, of All Things Considered, has been on the streets of Tehran for the procession today. Hey there, Mary Louise.
Good morning, Steve.
What have you seen?
Exactly what you just played. We have seen streets filled with thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Hard to capture the size of these crowds. Iranian state TV was putting it at millions. That's impossible to verify when you're in the thick of it, but huge turnout. And we saw signs saying exactly that, saying, hey, U.S., you started this, we will end it. We saw big red flags with the words hard revenge written across it. We saw signs reading down with USA in English. I'm told in Farsi they actually read death to USA, so a little bit stronger in the Persian version there. And then just everywhere, the number of billboards that they have put up seemingly overnight, certainly since Tehran woke up to the news of Soleimani's death on Friday. Billboards all over the city, many just within one block, showing the face of Soleimani, showing him with Supreme Leader Khamenei, calling him a martyr. And people are carrying handheld-sized versions of these signs, along with Down with USA signs. And the streets were jammed all morning long.
How were you responded to as an obvious foreigner in this crowd of people mourning a cult-like figure who was killed by the United States?
That's interesting. We definitely stood out. As I say, we saw thousands and thousands of people. I didn't see a single other person who looked visibly Western. It was all Iranians out there this morning, men, women, children. Many of them wanting to speak to us, wanting to tell us what was on their mind. At one point there was a huge crush as the crowd is being pushed back and people are almost being pushed over, and a guy crashed into me and nearly knocked me over, and immediately two other men stepped in, held their arms out, told him to get back, looked at me, put their hands to their hearts in a sign of respect and made sure I was okay, and then kept moving. So people were respectful, but also angry. We had people coming up and wanting to talk about revenge. One woman who we spoke to who plucked at my sleeve and wanted to stop. This is a woman who runs a travel agency here in Tehran. She says, I don't come out to demonstrations. This is not my thing. But she says, this man, Soleimani, died for the honor of Iran. So should I. I'm willing to fight. My family will fight.
And there's a bit of other news out of Tehran that Iran has suspended its cooperation with the nuclear deal, the deal that the United States has backed out of. What exactly are they saying?
That's right. Iran has been inching toward this, and now we have this statement from President Rouhani's office saying they will no longer observe the restrictions on fuel enrichment or on the size of enriched uranium stockpiles, but this is not a total collapse. They're saying they're going to continue cooperating with international inspectors, letting them into nuclear sites. So I want to underscore this is not yet Iran racing towards a nuclear bomb.
Mary Louise, thanks for the update.
You're welcome.
NPR's Mary Louise Kelly has been on the streets of Tehran today. Now, as Iran talks of hard revenge, that's a quote from Iranian officials, President Trump is making dramatic threats.
The president talked of destruction inside Iran. To legal experts, some of his statements sounded like threats to commit war crimes. He has added threats against Iraq. This is the country where a U.S. drone strike killed General Soleimani.
NPR White House reporter Aisha Roscoe is on the line. Aisha, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's work through the president's threats. What is he saying about Iran?
So he first raised this idea in a tweet over the weekend that the U.S. has a list of 52 potential targets for Iran, including some that are important to Iranian culture. Then he talked to reporters in his cabin and on Air Force One on his way back to D.C. from Florida, and he doubled down on this, saying that he doesn't think targeting cultural sites should be off limits. He said that Iran has killed, maimed, and tortured U.S. citizens, and if they can engage in that type of behavior, then the U.S. can go after culturally significant places.
Okay, a couple of symbolic things to note there. First, you said 52. The president said that number was chosen because that was the number of American hostages taken by Iranians at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran more than 40 years ago. But the other thing, saying that cultural sites would be targets for U.S. retaliation, is that legal?
It doesn't seem like it's legal in the sense that going after religious or cultural sites would be a violation of international treaties. For instance, the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property specifically bans this type of attack. So depending on what the president does, it could be a war crime.
So the president, as one of his statements said, it doesn't work that way, that the cultural sites are off limits, but it appears that according to international law that it generally does work that way, depending on the specific circumstances. Now, we mentioned the threats against Iraq, Iran's neighbor, which is where this attack took place. We know that Iraq's parliament voted to expel U.S. troops, in fact, voted to expel all foreign forces from the country. Non-binding at this point, but that was the vote in parliament. What's the president's response?
So he's threatening that if the government goes through with this, that the U.S. will impose very big sanctions. He said the sanctions would be even more severe than the U.S. sanctions on Iran. He said the U.S. would not leave unless Iraq pays back billions of dollars that the U.S. invested in an air base there. So the president is really ratcheting up his rhetoric toward Iran and Iraq.
Just to be clear, so the president is now threatening massive sanctions, worse sanctions than on Iran, against this country, Iraq, which has been broadly allied with the United States and that the U.S. is trying to encourage as a democracy. Is that correct?
Yes, he's saying that they will face sanctions if they don't allow U.S. troops to stay in Iraq.
One other thing, what is the administration saying about Americans' safety as we hear these threats of retaliation against Americans throughout the region?
So Secretary of State Mike Pompeo did a round of interviews yesterday, and he said that despite warnings from the State Department about being in Iraq, that America is safer today. Here's Pompeo on NBC's Meet the Press, where he was asked about expecting retaliation from Iran.
President Trump is focused deeply on keeping Americans safe over the long haul. Preserving and protecting, defending America is the mission that we have. It may be that there's a little noise here in the interim and that the Iranians make the choice to respond. I hope that they don't. President Trump has made clear what we will do in response if they do, that our response will be decisive and vigorous, just as it has been so far.
So Pompeo is promising retaliation if Iran retaliates against the U.S.
Aisha, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's NPR's Aisha Roscoe, and on this dramatic day, we have the view from Washington and from Tehran. In Australia, brush fires that started more than 4 months ago are still growing to the point where some of the damage is visible from space.
At least 25 people have died in these fires. Thousands have evacuated their homes. Smoke from the fires has made the air hazardous to breathe in some of Australia's biggest cities.
NPR's Jason Beaubien is in one of those cities, Sydney, Australia. Hi there, Jason.
Hey, good morning.
What have you been seeing and hearing and smelling where you are?
I mean, these fires are just dominating Australia at the moment. It is kind of amazing when you think about it. Just from Western Australia, you've got a bunch of truckers that just had to be led out of the outback by police to get them through these fires that had been trapping them for days. Meanwhile, all the way on the other side of the country, on the southeast, you've got people who have been stranded on beaches. You've had people in South Australia on Kangaroo Island being killed by fires that are sweeping through. And this is all just in the last few days. And these fires have been going on for months. People are saying this is unprecedented. That's what I'm hearing from people. And they also seem to be recognizing that this seems to be the new normal. People accept that most of the people that I talk to say, yeah, they can see that the climate is changing. It's much hotter. For 2019, it was the hottest and driest year on record. So people are trying to just scramble to cope with it the best they can.
How does it affect people's health when they are breathing smoky air beneath an orange sky month after month after month?
You know, people are saying that this is really not good for people's health. And in Canberra, the capital, which is south of me from Sydney, they've had air pollution that is 20 times what the government considers to be a hazardous level. That was just over this past weekend. Institutions have shut down. Kindergartens have been telling the people to keep their kids at home. The amount of smoke that is being generated by these unprecedented fires, it's having a huge effect on people's health.
Does it affect people even in Sydney where you are, where it seems to be safe, but people look at a map and know they're surrounded by fire?
I mean, you do see it in the air here. It's quite hazy. Definitely the smoke from the surrounding fires drifts in here. It's not as bad. We are on the coast, and so it tends to blow through. It's not as bad as some of these other places. But in the southeast, there's planes that were coming in to try to do an evacuation out of this town where people have been stranded on a beach, and they couldn't get the planes in there because the sky was just this orange of smoke. They had some cameras inside the cockpit, and you could just look out from the cockpit, and all you could see was just this orange haze. The impact of the smoke has been just huge in the places where the fires are really burning at the hottest.
Okay, thanks very much. That's NPR's Jason Beaubien in Sydney.
This could happen to anybody. You accidentally send an email before it's quite ready. But the U.S. military did this on the high-stakes question of keeping U.S. troops in Iraq. And the astonishing mistake added to the sense of chaos.
Yeah, last week, a U.S. airstrike killed an Iranian general on Iraqi soil. Then on Sunday, Iraq's parliament, in response, voted to expel all foreign forces, which would include U.S. forces. Then on Monday, the U.S. sent a letter suggesting U.S. forces really would go. Then Pentagon officials insisted the letter was a draft sent too soon and that U.S. forces are not leaving.
NPR's Tom Bowman starts our coverage off this morning. So, Tom, I don't get it. This is a huge mistake. How does something like this happen?
Well, we never really got a good explanation. It was a draft letter again. It was written by one of the American generals, Brigadier General William Seeley, to the Iraqi government. It was dated yesterday and not signed. And the letter indicated that U.S. forces would reposition in preparation to leave the country. And it ended by saying the U.S. respects the will of Iraq. So it indicated the troops would leave because of Parliament's decision. But Defense Secretary Esper and Joint Chiefs Chair General Mark Milley said it was a mistake, poorly worded, and again, a draft.
Wow.
The letter was leaked, and it's caused a lot of confusion in the press, social media, and also at the Pentagon, frankly. An official got a copy of the letter, ran it up to General Milley, and again, both Esper and Milley came down to talk to the press. And again,
which is not usual. They don't do that a lot.
No. And it, again, stress the U.S. is not leaving, at least not yet. And then General Milley came down again after he read the letter. Initially, they say they had not read the letter and came back and reiterated, listen, it's a draft, poorly worded, a mistake. We're not leaving. Again, so not yet.
Where are the troops going? I mean, you say the repositioning. What does that mean?
Right. Well, Esper said that he talked about the non-binding resolution in the Iraqi parliament. He noted that many parliament members did not vote, especially Kurds and Sunnis. He did say, though, that some troops would reposition within the country to more defensible areas. Some would actually leave the country for Kuwait. Other troops would come in to protect the troops that are there.
But leaving to go to Kuwait. So some will leave.
Right, some would leave to go to Kuwait. The total number there is roughly 5,000 troops. So the bulk of the troops, at least right now, will stay there in Iraq. And officials on background told me, listen, we're not sure if all Iraqi leaders want the U.S. to leave. And Esper said, listen, some Iraqi lawmakers and the Iraqi public want the U.S. to remain. He said the U.S. wants a prosperous Iraq, and Iran wants to control the country as a proxy. So we're still in this sort of nether zone of exactly what's going on here.
All right, NPR's Pentagon correspondent Tom Bowman for us this morning. Tom, we appreciate it. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So, what are Iraqis saying about all of this?
Well, their debate over the U.S. troop presence in their country has taken a bit of a pause because of the funeral proceedings for the Iraqi official who was killed, along with Soleimani in last week's drone strike. And there are now reports of mourners who have been killed in a stampede during Soleimani's burial this morning in Iran.
NPR's Jane Arraf is following all of this, joins us now from Baghdad. So we have been watching in Iran the procession, the funeral proceedings of Qasem Soleimani. Meanwhile, you, though, Jane, have been watching the funeral processions for the other man who was killed in this drone strike, who was an Iraqi official, right?
He was a very senior Iraqi official, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. He was the deputy head of paramilitaries in Iraq, and he was the leader of one of the main Iran-backed militias. So when his body arrived from Iran, where it had been taken, crowds and crowds of mourners turned out to the bridge where it was coming across with this flatbed truck that was carrying his coffin draped in flags and covered in flowers. There were huge crowds, but in Iran, meanwhile, Qasem Soleimani's funeral, where millions of people across the country have come out. State TV there in Iran says that people were killed this morning when a stampede broke out at those funeral proceedings in his hometown in southeastern Iran. In Basra, meanwhile, the speakers who were leading the proceedings denounced the United States. Basra has had a difficult relationship with these militias. They're believed to be responsible for killing hundreds of protesters in anti-government protests, but those protesters are certainly lying low today.
So what does this mean for the decision-making in Baghdad? I mean, we just heard from Tom there, the confusion on the Pentagon's part. They, at one point, there was a letter saying, okay, Iraqi parliament, we hear you. You want us out, we'll go. That was premature, we're now learning. So what is the position of the Iraqi government?
So the confusion over that letter is partly because under the rules that the U.S. military operates here, they have to get permission for movements like that. So they need to inform the U.S. when they're flying helicopters. And they were indeed flying helicopters last night for hours in and out of the green zone. A military spokesman here said those are mostly coalition and NATO troops, a few hundred of them, going out to a safer place in the region. And safer because that U.S. base is located in the green zone, which is a frequent target of Iran-backed militias. The background of this, of course, is the political disarray. This drone strike and the outrage over it have made Shia parties, which dominate Iraqi politics, even more powerful. And there is still a lot of outrage to be felt here.
Of course, there are other forces and other views in Iraq, and we heard one of them on NPR News. We were speaking with Hoshar Zabari. He's a Kurdish leader. Kurds are among the groups that would like U.S. troops to stay. And let's listen to some of what he had to say in the NPR interview.
Well, we don't want our country to be a battlefield or a place to settle scores between the United States, Iran, and others. But let's be realistic. It is happening. And the Iraqi government and the system is in a deep crisis.
He's saying, look, Iran is very powerful in Iraq. We need the U.S. there as a counterbalance and also to fight ISIS. What do you make of that, Jane Arraf?
Well, that is a great point, and he is the man who negotiated the legal basis for allowing U.S. troops to stay here these past few years. And basically what it means is that the Kurds, and he is a Kurd, feel very strongly that U.S. troops should stay. This is a very divided country.
Just briefly, Jane, meanwhile, President Trump has said if Iraq insists that U.S. troops are leaving, he's going to put new sanctions on.
Yes, that's a huge fear here as well. A lot of Iraqis have very deep, very bad memories of sweeping sanctions during the 1990s. And that is entering the political equation as well. It's a cautionary tale for many politicians who believe that troops should stay.
NPR's Jane Arraf in Baghdad. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.
All right. I want to give you a heads up that this next topic is going to include descriptions of sexual assault. It will be disturbing to some listeners. We're talking about Harvey Weinstein. He has been accused of sexual misconduct by more than 80 women and is now facing criminal charges in California and New York.
Just hours after the former film executive entered a Manhattan courtroom where he will stand trial for sexual assault, Weinstein was charged with 4 more counts of rape and sexual battery in Los Angeles.
We believe the evidence will show that the defendant used his power and influence to gain access to his victims and then committed violent crimes against them.
Los Angeles County District Attorney Jackie Lacey announced the latest charges against a man whose case helped to spark the Me Too movement.
Gene Mattis has been covering the allegations against Weinstein for Variety, and he joins us now from Los Angeles. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
What do we know about the new charges?
There are 4 charges involving 2 women who claim that Weinstein sexually assaulted them about 2 days apart in February of 2013. The first woman is an Italian model who alleges that Weinstein raped her at a hotel and that he subsequently threatened that if she told anybody that he would kill her. And that's why she says she didn't report it at the time. The second woman says that 2 days later she met Weinstein with an acquaintance at another hotel and that Weinstein was able to sort of persuade her to come up to his room and that he sexually assaulted her in the bathroom there. There are actually, in fact, 8 women in total who have come to the Los Angeles authorities with claims like this. And the DA announced yesterday that they were not prosecuting 3 of those cases because they were too old. They were outside of the statute of limitations, but the other 3 cases are still under investigation.
So, Gene, is this just a coincidence that these charges were filed on the same day that the criminal trial in New York started?
The district attorney said it was a coincidence. I think they have been coordinating, certainly, with the New York prosecutors. So I think pretty clearly they decided that the New York case would go first. They've known about both of these allegations for a couple of years. So, they could have charged it earlier, certainly. But I think they waited until the trial got underway in New York just to sort of make it clear that the New York case is going forward first. And then once that's taken care of, they'll come to L.A.
Is Weinstein responding to the new charges or his attorneys?
He has not responded yet. His attorneys or his spokespeople have not responded. But, in general, of course, they've denied any allegations of rape or sexual assault.
And briefly, what can we expect from the second day of the trial in New York?
Jury selection is supposed to get underway. There is sort of a new wrinkle potentially with the Los Angeles case in that they could ask to increase bail because arguably the risk of flight is now greater.
All right, Variety's Gene Mattis on the Harvey Weinstein trial and new charges coming.